What if I told you that the most feared warriors in human history weren't created by superior weapons, better training, or even natural courage? What if the secret behind Sparta's terrifying reputation had nothing to do with bronze shields, crimson cloaks, or those legendary abs we see in the movies? The truth is far more disturbing and fascinating than Hollywood could ever imagine. For over 8 centuries, one Greek city-state struck such fear into the hearts of enemies that conquerors who had crushed entire empires would literally change direction rather than face them in battle. Alexander the Great conquered territories from Egypt to India, but he never set foot in Sparta. The Romans, who would eventually rule the known world, spent decades carefully avoiding direct confrontation with this single city. What was their secret weapon? It wasn't what you think. It was something far more powerful than any sword or spear, something that could transform ordinary human beings into killing machines so effective that the word Spartan still means ultimate discipline and sacrifice 2,500 years later. Tonight, we're going to uncover the dark legal system that created history's most perfect warriors and discover why that perfection ultimately destroyed them. Picture this. A lone messenger arrives at the gates of Athens, bloodied and exhausted after riding hard for 3 days across the mountainous terrain of ancient Greece. His horse is lathered with sweat, its flanks heaving from the desperate journey. The messenger dismounts on shaking legs and approaches the city guards with trembling hands. He carries with him a simple message, just 2 words written on a piece of leather: if. That's it. Just if. The Athenian guards look at each other in confusion. What kind of message is this? But as word spreads through the city, the citizens understand immediately, and the blood drains from their faces. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great and conqueror of most of Greece, had been sending threatening messages to all the Greek city-states. To Athens, he had written a long ultimatum: if you do not surrender immediately, I will invade your lands with 50,000 men. I will destroy your walls, burn your temples, slaughter your soldiers, and sell your women and children into slavery. To Thebes, if you do not submit to Macedonian rule, I will erase your city from the earth so completely that future generations will not even remember its name. But to Sparta, just one word: if. The Spartans received this message with the kind of calm that comes only from absolute confidence. They didn't call emergency meetings or send ambassadors to negotiate. Instead, they sent the messenger back to Philip with a single word carved into bronze. What? Philip, who had conquered most of the known world, read that single word and made a decision that would echo through history. He never invaded Sparta. Neither did his son Alexander, who would go on to conquer territories from Egypt to India, who would defeat the mighty Persian Empire and spread Greek culture to the edges of the known world. What was it about this single Greek city that made even the greatest conquerors think twice? What secret weapon did they possess that was more powerful than war elephants, more terrifying than cavalry charges, more effective than siege engines? Tonight, we're going to uncover the secret that made Sparta the most feared military machine in the ancient world. It wasn't just their bronze shields or long spears. It wasn't even their legendary physical training. The real secret behind Sparta's fearsome reputation was something much deeper. Their law, not just any law, but a single, comprehensive legal system so revolutionary that it transformed an ordinary Greek city-state into a machine specifically designed to produce the finest warriors the world had ever seen. Our story begins in the 8th century BCE, when the world was young and possibilities seemed endless. In the valley of Laconia in southern Greece, there was a settlement that would have seemed unremarkable to any casual observer. The land was fertile but not extraordinary. The people were Greek, like dozens of other tribes scattered across the Mediterranean. The settlement's name was Sparta, and at first glance, nothing suggested it was destined for greatness. Houses were simple structures of mud, brick, and stone. The people dressed in rough wool clothing. Their pottery was functional but not artistic. But beneath the surface, forces were at work that would transform not just Sparta, but the entire ancient world. The problem facing Sparta was the same confronting every society in the ancient world: how to organize human beings to survive in a dangerous environment. The world of ancient Greece was one of constant warfare. City-states fought over boundaries, trade routes, and resources. Pirates raided coastal settlements. Barbarian tribes swept down from the north. Natural disasters could devastate entire regions overnight. Military strength wasn't just an advantage, it was an absolute necessity for survival. But creating effective military forces was extraordinarily difficult. Most ancient societies relied on part-time soldiers who would take up arms during emergencies, then return to their fields when the crisis passed. This system had obvious limitations. Part-time soldiers couldn't develop sophisticated tactics or unit cohesion. They couldn't maintain the conditioning necessary for sustained combat. Most critically, they couldn't be counted on to stand and fight when battles turned against them. Sparta was facing all these challenges, plus additional problems specific to their situation. The population was growing rapidly, but farmable land remained fixed. Young men had no prospects, no land to inherit. Social tensions were rising as gaps between rich and poor widened. Most societies either collapse or muddle through with partial reforms. But Sparta chose a different path entirely. They chose to completely reinvent themselves, to tear down their existing social structure and rebuild it according to a radical new vision. The man credited with this transformation was Lycurgus, though whether he was a real historical figure or a legendary composite remains debated. What matters isn't historical accuracy, but what the Lycurgus legend represents: a complete reimagining of how human society could be organized. According to tradition, Lycurgus was troubled by social problems tearing his community apart. Rather than patching the existing system, he embarked on an extraordinary journey across the known world. He traveled to Crete, where he studied military training systems. He visited Egypt, observing how one of the world's oldest civilizations maintained stability through strong authority and military discipline. He studied Greek cities in Asia Minor, seeing how communities under constant threat had adapted their laws to maximize military effectiveness. When Lycurgus returned to Sparta, he brought something unprecedented in human history: a comprehensive blueprint for the complete transformation of society. This wasn't just new laws or reformed institutions. This was social engineering on a scale that wouldn't be attempted again until modern times. The system Lycurgus designed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Instead of chaotic webs of competing interests characterizing most ancient societies, he created something entirely new: a total system where every aspect of human life would be governed by a single, integrated legal framework designed for one purpose: creating the perfect warrior society. Every great legal system has its founding document. For Sparta, this was the Great Rhetra, the Great Saying. Unlike other ancient law codes with hundreds of specific provisions, the Great Rhetra was remarkably brief, perhaps only a few hundred words. Yet from this simple foundation, an entire civilization would grow. The genius lay not in what it said, but in what it established: a constitutional framework so flexible yet stable that it could govern a society for 8 centuries. The Great Rhetra began by establishing a unique political structure unlike any other government in the Greek world. Most Greek cities were ruled by tyrants or struggled with chaotic democratic assemblies. Sparta created something different, a system of checks and balances that distributed power while ensuring quick decision-making when needed. At the top were two kings, not one, but two. This prevented any individual from becoming a tyrant, as each king checked the other's power. The dual kingship also solved practical military problems. In war, one king could lead armies while the other governed at home. But despite impressive titles, the kings had limited actual power. They were primarily military leaders and religious figureheads. Real governing power was exercised by the Gerousia, a council of 30 men including the two kings plus 28 elders elected by citizens. The Gerousia had extraordinary authority extending far beyond advisory roles. They could propose laws, serve as supreme court, conduct trials for treason, and even put kings on trial if they violated their oaths. The composition reflected deep thinking about age, experience, and wisdom. The 28 elected elders had to be at least 60, an age representing substantial experience and detachment from personal ambition in the ancient world. The election process minimized political campaigning. Candidates appeared before assembled citizens without speeches or promises. They simply walked past while citizens shouted approval or disapproval. The loudest, longest sustained shout won the position for life. This system prevented lengthy campaigns, bribery, and deal-making. It favored candidates widely known and respected rather than those skilled at manipulation or possessing wealth. The citizen assembly, the ecclesia, included all male Spartan citizens over 30. They could approve or reject Gerousia proposals but couldn't amend them or engage in open debate. This prevented endless discussions that paralyzed other cities while ensuring complex questions were thoroughly considered by experienced Gerousia members. Finally, the great Rhetra established the ephorate. 5 ephors elected annually wielded powers unthinkable in most ancient societies. They could oversee kings, convene Gerousia meetings, investigate crimes, and even arrest and try royal family members who violated laws. Think how radical this was. In most ancient societies, kings were divine figures above human law. The idea that kings could be held accountable by elected officials was revolutionary. This complex system created a government that was neither monarchy, oligarchy, nor democracy, but something new. A mixed constitution preventing any individual or group from gaining too much control while ensuring efficient decision-making. But the political structure was only the beginning. More important was the fundamental principle the great Rhetra established: complete subordination of individual interests to state welfare. In most societies, family is considered civilization's basic unit, with parents having natural rights to raise children according to their values. Sparta created something unprecedented: a legal system where the state claimed ownership of children from birth, regulating family life to ensure every aspect served military needs. When children were born in Sparta, they weren't automatically community members. Babies were taken by fathers to tribal elders who examined them for physical weakness, deformity, or poor health. Strong, healthy babies were returned to families and registered as future citizens. Those with problems were carried to a chasm on Mount Taygetus and left to die. This reveals something crucial about Spartan thinking. They saw human life as valuable only insofar as it served collective good. This utilitarian approach shaped every aspect of society. For children passing initial inspection, the first 7 years were spent with families, but even then, law regulated upbringing in remarkable detail. Parents were required to raise children according to state-mandated guidelines prioritizing physical toughening over emotional nurturing. Spartan infants were deliberately kept hungry, given just enough food to grow but never feel satisfied. They were bathed in wine rather than water, believed to strengthen the constitution. They were left to cry without comfort, taught to endure discomfort without complaint. At age 7, boys' lives changed dramatically. They were taken from families and enrolled in the agoge, a 13-year military training program designed to transform boys into unprecedented soldiers. The law was absolute. Every Spartan male citizen had to complete this training. There were no alternatives for the wealthy, no exemptions for the scholarly, no special provisions for family connections. Complete it successfully, and you become a full citizen. Fail, and you become a social outcast with no rights, opportunities, or hope of marriage. This created something unprecedented. A citizenry where every male shared exactly the same formative experience. When Spartan soldiers fought, they battled alongside men who had endured identical challenges, learned identical lessons, and developed identical attitudes toward duty and sacrifice. The agoge was organized around progressive challenge and responsibility. Boys were divided into age groups supervised by recent graduates. This created a system where every participant had dual roles: student learning from elders and teacher instructing younger boys. Boys were deliberately kept hungry, receiving just enough food to survive but never feel satisfied. This kept them physically lean and mentally sharp while teaching them to function under discomfort and encouraging resourcefulness. They were actually encouraged to steal food, but only if undetected. Discovery meant severe punishment, not for stealing but for lack of skill in avoiding detection. This taught that success mattered more than moral purity, that cunning was a military virtue, and that failure brought consequences worse than discomfort. Living conditions were deliberately harsh. Boys slept on beds of rushes gathered by hand, wore simple tunics year-round regardless of weather, bathed infrequently, and had no luxuries or personal possessions. Physical training was extraordinarily demanding. Hours daily in athletics, gymnastics, weapons training, and combat exercises. They learned every weapon: spears, swords, shields, javelins, bows. They practiced individual combat and group formations, engaging in competitive sports emphasizing strength, endurance, and pain tolerance. Most importantly, they learned to compete in ways reinforcing military values. Individual achievement was celebrated only when contributing to group success. This created psychological profiles perfectly adapted to hoplite warfare, where success depended on coordinated units rather than individual heroics. The educational content included cultural knowledge young Spartans needed as citizens: literacy, though not scholarly proficiency; music, particularly martial songs; laws and customs, stories of famous warriors, and religious rituals. Spartan treatment of women was as revolutionary as their approach to men, though serving different purposes within the military system. Unlike other Greek cities where women were confined to domestic roles with minimal education, Spartan girls participated in athletic training, learned literacy, and were expected to develop physical strength and mental acuity. This wasn't progressive thinking about women's rights. It was understanding that strong warriors could only come from strong mothers. Spartan law required girls to engage in regular athletic training: running, wrestling, javelin throwing, dancing. They competed publicly while wearing short tunics or sometimes nude, practices scandalizing other Greeks but serving specific Spartan purposes. Physical training prepared women for childbirth demands and child-rearing in a society requiring mothers to be strong, independent, and capable of managing affairs while husbands were on campaign for months or years. Public competitions allowed young men to observe potential wives and evaluate fitness for marriage and motherhood. They created social pressure for maintaining high physical standards and reinforced Spartan values, prioritizing strength and skill over beauty or wealth. Girls also received intellectual education more comprehensive than available to women elsewhere. Literacy, mathematics, music, and property management. This education was provided because Spartan law recognized that soldiers' wives needed capability for handling complex responsibilities independently. Spartan marriage law began with the revolutionary premise that marriage's primary purpose wasn't personal happiness or economic alliance, but producing strong, healthy children who could be trained as soldiers. Instead of focusing on wealth and family connections like other Greek cities, Spartan marriage law prioritized physical fitness and genetic quality. The goal wasn't creating political alliances or accumulating property. It was producing the strongest possible children. This meant marriage law included provisions recognizable today as eugenics. People who were physically weak, mentally disabled, or carried hereditary diseases were discouraged or prohibited from marrying. But the system was more sophisticated than simple eugenics. The law included provisions maximizing genetic diversity within the citizen population, recognizing that military effectiveness required diversity in physical and mental characteristics for different military roles. The actual courtship process was unlike anything practiced elsewhere. Instead of formal family negotiations, young Spartans engaged in ritualized courtship emphasizing physical prowess and competitive achievement through athletic competitions and public ceremonies. When a man decided to pursue marriage, he would attempt to capture his bride in a ritualized ceremony involving physical contest and symbolic representation of the warrior's role. The bride would pretend resistance, requiring the groom to demonstrate strength and determination. Marriage ceremonies were deliberately simple and austere, without elaborate feasting and expensive gifts characterizing weddings elsewhere. This reflected the principle that resources should be devoted to military effectiveness rather than private luxury. Perhaps most unusual was regulation of married couples' living arrangements. Young married men were required to continue living in communal barracks, visiting wives secretly at night and returning before dawn. This continued until age 30, when they could finally establish proper households. This arrangement ensured young men's primary loyalty remained with military units rather than families. The bonds formed through living and training together were crucial to battlefield effectiveness. Secret marital visits maintained the physical and psychological conditioning developed during the agoge while actually strengthening marriages by maintaining romantic intensity. The law also included provisions for alternative arrangements ensuring strong genetic lines continued. If couples couldn't produce children, alternative partnerships were encouraged, with full legal recognition of offspring. These weren't considered adultery because they served the state's interest in maximizing potential soldiers. Underneath the gleaming armor and heroic achievements, Spartan society depended on one of the largest and most oppressive slave systems in the ancient world. The Helots weren't foreigners captured in war, but descendants of Greeks conquered during Spartan expansion. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and shared basic cultural background with their masters, but had been systematically reduced to slavery so completely it shocked other societies. Helots' legal status was unique. They weren't individual property but belonged collectively to the state, assigned to work citizen families' land holdings. This meant no citizen could make independent decisions about Helots. They were managed according to state policy, maximizing productivity while minimizing rebellion risk. The Helot system was essential to Spartan military success because it solved the fundamental economic problem limiting military effectiveness elsewhere. Most Greek cities depended on citizen soldiers who were also farmers, craftsmen, or merchants, requiring balance between military obligations and economic activities. Sparta eliminated this conflict by creating a system prohibiting citizens from productive labor. Spartan men were full-time soldiers from 20 to 60, with food, clothing, shelter, and equipment provided by Helot labor under state supervision. This allowed complete devotion to military training and service. Citizens could spend months on campaign without worrying about crops or businesses. They could maintain peak conditioning and tactical proficiency while developing unit cohesion crucial for phalanx fighting. But maintaining this system required legal controls extraordinary even by ancient standards. Helots outnumbered citizens by ratios reaching 10 to 1 or higher. Effective resistance could have overwhelmed masters through numbers, requiring prevention through terror, surveillance, and systematic demoralization. The legal framework was designed around preventing solidarity, leadership, or hope among slaves. Helots were forbidden free travel, gathering in groups, carrying weapons, or any activity facilitating communication and organization. Most disturbing was the Cryptia, the hidden thing, a systematic terrorism program preventing effective leadership development. Each year, promising young citizens recently completing the agoge were selected for the Cryptia, given weapons and sent into the countryside with orders to kill helots showing intelligence, strength, leadership potential, or resistance signs. The Cryptia operated secretly, striking at night and leaving no evidence. Marked helots simply disappeared, creating terror designed to discourage resistance thoughts. The program also served as advanced military training, teaching stealth, reconnaissance, and killing skills valuable in regular warfare. This state-sponsored terrorism was legally sanctioned and considered essential to national security. Law explicitly declared helots as state enemies, meaning killing them wasn't murder but military service. Annual declarations of war by Ephors provided legal cover for necessary violence. Helot economic productivity was maintained through sharecropping requiring fixed agricultural produce delivery, typically half of everything produced. They could keep the remainder, providing just enough work motivation while preventing resource accumulation, enabling resistance. This system was remarkably economically efficient. Helot communities were self-sustaining, requiring minimal supervision during normal activities. They had enough freedom for effective farming techniques and enough incentive for productivity, while bearing all agricultural risks. But the Helot system created military vulnerabilities, eventually contributing to Spartan decline. Controlling such large, potentially hostile populations required constant vigilance and significant military resource deployment. Citizens couldn't all leave on extended campaigns because too many had to monitor helots and respond to unrest. The need for helot control also shaped military strategy, limiting options during major conflicts. They couldn't risk weakening domestic security by deploying too many troops for extended periods, even when strategic opportunities might have justified such deployments. Even as helots labored in fields, Spartan citizens lived according to legal codes regulating behavior in ways unimaginable in other societies. The most important institution was the syssitia, communal mess halls where all adult male citizens were required to eat meals. This wasn't a social custom or practical feeding arrangement. It was a legal requirement shaping fundamental aspects of social and political life. Every citizen from 20 to 60 was required by law to belong to a syssitia and take evening meals there daily when in the city. The only acceptable excuse was active military service outside Spartan territory. This prevented exclusive social circles based on wealth, family connections, or personal preferences. In other cities, the wealthy might form dining clubs excluding ordinary citizens, creating opportunities for political conspiracies and factional divisions undermining social unity. Sparta eliminated these possibilities by requiring all citizens to participate in the same basic institution. Rich and poor, young and old, politically powerful and ordinary citizens ate the same food in the same halls according to identical rules, creating social equality unique in the ancient world, equality in austerity rather than luxury. The admission process was carefully regulated to reinforce military values. Young men completing the agoge couldn't simply choose mess halls based on friendships or family connections. They had to apply for membership and win existing member approval through a secret ballot. This served as final testing of agoge-taught values. Young men developing attitudes inconsistent with Spartan military culture found admission to good syssitia difficult. Without admission, they couldn't participate fully in society. Daily routines became centers of social life. Every evening, members gathered sharing meals prepared according to strict legal requirements. Black broth, barley bread, cheese, occasionally sacrificial meat. The food was deliberately simple, nutritious, and adequate, but not luxurious. Law explicitly forbade elaborate cooking, imported delicacies, or wealth displays through food. This prevented class distinction development based on wealth. Rich Spartans couldn't use fine dining for status display or creating social obligations competing with military duties. Conversation was also regulated. Members were expected to discuss military matters, political questions, and moral issues. Frivolous topics, private affair gossip, and business talk were discouraged. Young members listened more than spoke, learning about Spartan history, values, and traditions. Most importantly, syssitia created bonds extending beyond dinner tables. These weren't just eating clubs, they were military units. Men sharing meals also fought together, collectively responsible for each other's behavior in war and peace. If a member behaved dishonorably in battle, fleeing combat or showing cowardice, messmates shared his disgrace. Conversely, if a member distinguished himself, messmates shared his glory. This collective responsibility created powerful incentives for mutual monitoring and support. Economic obligations were carefully regulated. Each member was required to contribute fixed agricultural produce amounts monthly: barley, wine, cheese, figs. These contributions were called fiditia, and failure to provide them was grounds for expulsion. This ensured every citizen maintained economic productivity and connection to Spartan society's agricultural foundation. Even though citizens didn't work land directly, they had to ensure helots produced enough surplus for syssitia obligations. The entire system created a society where privacy and individualism were virtually impossible. Every citizen was constantly observed, held accountable, and reminded of group obligations. This would be considered oppressive by modern standards, but was remarkably effective at producing military unity and discipline, making Sparta famous. When Spartan soldiers fought, they weren't defending abstract concepts like the state. They were defending messmates, men they had eaten with, talked with, and lived alongside for years or decades. Bonds created by the syssitia were so strong they could override basic survival instincts. All social, economic, and political structures existed for one purpose: creating the most effective military force in the ancient world. Military service wasn't optional. It was a legal obligation lasting from 20 to 60. This wasn't just wartime service, but continuous active duty taking precedence over all other activities. Compare this to other Greek cities where military service was episodic and part-time. Athenian farmers might be called up for campaign season months, then return to normal occupations. Spartan citizens were soldiers first. Everything else was secondary. This meant Spartan units had decades to develop unit cohesion, tactical sophistication, and combat experience. While other armies were composed of part-time warriors fighting together only occasionally, Spartan formations trained constantly and fought as integrated units with perfect coordination. Law specified not just that citizens had to serve, but how they served. Spartan military regulations were extraordinarily detailed, covering everything from equipment standards to battlefield formations to engagement rules. Every soldier was required to provide his own equipment according to strict specifications. The famous bronze shield had to be of a particular size and weight. Long spears had to meet specific length requirements. Even red cloaks became symbols regulated by law. Color, material, and design were standardized. This standardization served multiple purposes, ensuring all soldiers could fight effectively in formation with compatible, complementary equipment, preventing wealthy soldiers from gaining advantages through superior gear disrupting unit cohesion, and creating visual uniformity psychologically intimidating to enemies. But law went far beyond equipment requirements, regulating battlefield behavior with precision impressing modern military organizations. Spartan soldiers were forbidden from pursuing fleeing enemies beyond certain distances from main formations, preventing individual heroics breaking the disciplined phalanx formation that was the Spartan tactical foundation. They were required to maintain battle line positions even when wounded, unless ordered to withdraw by commanders. Soldiers leaving positions without authorization, even to help wounded comrades, could be tried and executed for cowardice. They were forbidden from taking personal trophies from defeated enemies until battles were completely over and fields secured, preventing soldiers from breaking formation to loot dead, common problems in other ancient armies. Most remarkably, Spartan military law included detailed battlefield conduct regulations designed to maintain discipline and morale even facing certain death. If formations were surrounded facing annihilation, law required continued fighting rather than surrender or flight attempts. This wasn't fanaticism, it was calculated military logic. Spartans understood armies often won or lost based on psychological rather than purely material factors. Enemies, knowing Spartans would never surrender or retreat, had to prepare for death every time they faced Spartan forces. This pressure often caused enemies to break before fighting became decisive. Law also included provisions for dealing with military code violations. Penalties were severe but precisely calibrated to reinforce values the system was designed to promote. Soldiers fleeing battle faced not just legal punishment but social ostracism, arguably worse than death. Stripped of citizenship rights, expelled from Sicilia, forbidden from participating in religious or social activities. Families were shamed, property confiscated, becoming essentially non-persons. But law provided redemption mechanisms. Soldiers showing cowardice could potentially restore honor through exceptional bravery in subsequent battles. The legal system thus encouraged not just initial courage but sustained military excellence, overcoming past failures. Conversely, soldiers distinguishing themselves were rewarded not just with personal honor but legal privileges and social advancement. Military decorations weren't ceremonial. They came with concrete benefits in political rights, economic opportunities, and social status. This created incentive systems, making military excellence the most reliable path to Spartan success. Men might be born into modest families with limited resources, but exceptional military service could elevate them to leadership and influence positions. All these military laws worked together, creating armies unlike anything else in the ancient world. Spartan soldiers weren't just individually brave and skillful. They were part of military systems refined over centuries to maximize collective effectiveness. When 300 Spartans stood at Thermopylae choosing death over retreat, they weren't making individual decisions based on personal heroism. They were following legal and cultural codes, making retreat impossible and death in battle the highest achievable honor. In the summer of 480 BCE, a small force of Greeks faced the largest army the world had ever seen at a narrow pass called Thermopylae. The Persian Emperor Xerxes commanded over 1 million men soldiers from dozens of nations stretching from India to Egypt. Against this vast host stood approximately 7,000 Greeks, led by 300 Spartans under King Leonidas. When Xerxes sent a messenger demanding that the Greeks surrender their weapons, Leonidas reportedly replied with 2 words, "Molin Labe, come and take them." When a Persian herald boasted that their arrows would be so numerous that they would block out the sun, a Spartan warrior named Dionys supposedly responded, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." And when the battle was over, every single one of the 300 Spartans was dead. They had held the pass for 3 days against impossible odds, inflicting enormous casualties on the Persian army and buying precious time for the other Greek cities to prepare their defenses. This wasn't random heroism or spontaneous courage. This was the predictable result of a legal system that had been designed over centuries to produce exactly this kind of military behavior. By the 5th century BCE, Sparta had achieved something unprecedented. Society perfectly designed for military excellence. Their soldiers were the best trained, most disciplined, and most feared in the ancient world. Their political system was stable and efficient. Their economy was productive and sustainable. Yet even at power's height, cracks were beginning to show. The very laws making Sparta great were also creating problems, eventually leading to decline and fall. The most fundamental problem was demographic. The legal system was designed around stable or growing citizen population assumptions. But constant warfare's harsh realities, combined with strict citizenship requirements, were causing full Spartan citizen numbers to decline steadily. Becoming a Spartan citizen required completing agoge training and gaining Syssitia admission. These demanding requirements not everyone could meet. Young men injured during training, failing to demonstrate adequate military skills, or unable to gain existing Syssitia approval found themselves excluded from full citizenship. Initially, this exclusion served useful functions by ensuring only the most capable became citizens. But over time, it meant the citizen population wasn't replacing itself through natural reproduction. The problem was compounded by warfare realities. Spartan soldiers were expected to fight in the most dangerous positions and accept death rather than retreat. This meant the citizen class constantly lost its most courageous and capable members to battle casualties. Under normal circumstances, these losses might have been offset by admitting worthy individuals from Perioeci or foreign populations. But Spartan law made such promotions extremely difficult. Legal citizenship requirements were so strict and cultural barriers so high that few non-citizens could ever hope to join full Spartan ranks. By the 4th century BCE, full Spartan citizen numbers had fallen to fewer than 1,000 men, barely enough to maintain basic military formations, let alone field large armies, making Sparta dominant in earlier centuries. The economic foundation was also cracking. Helot populations were growing restless after centuries of oppression, and maintaining control required increasing portions of Spartan military resources. Moreover, rigid economic laws prohibiting citizens from trade or commerce were putting Sparta at disadvantage compared to other Greek cities growing wealthy through Mediterranean trade networks. Athens, Corinth, and other commercial centers were using economic resources to hire professional soldiers and build powerful navies. Sparta's citizen soldiers were still superior in individual combat, but were being outnumbered by enemy forces with economic resources to field larger armies. Social laws were also creating unexpected problems. The Syssitia system, so effective at creating military unity, was becoming a barrier to necessary reforms. Conservative, tradition-bound mess hall cultures made it difficult for Spartans to adapt to new military technologies or tactical innovations. This conservatism was reinforced by the legal system itself. Spartan law was presented not as human legislation changeable when circumstances required, but as divine revelation binding for all time. The mythical Lycurgus was said to have received laws directly from Delphi oracle, making modifications tantamount to sacrilege. This created a psychological and legal barrier to reform that proved nearly impossible to overcome. Even when it became clear that certain laws were creating problems, the Spartan political system lacked mechanisms for making necessary changes. The irony is that Sparta's legal system was too successful. It had created a society that was perfectly adapted to the military conditions of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, but it was too rigid to evolve when those conditions changed. Other Greek cities, with their messiae, more chaotic political systems, and their greater tolerance for social experimentation, proved more adaptable to changing circumstances. Athens, in particular, was able to reinvent itself multiple times as conditions changed, developing new forms of government, new economic systems, and new military strategies as needed. Sparta, locked into its legal straitjacket, could only continue doing what it had always done, even when that was no longer sufficient for success. The beginning of the end came with Sparta's victory in the Peloponnesian War against Athens in 404 BCE. This should have been Sparta's greatest triumph moment, vindication of their military system and social organization. Instead, it marked the beginning of decline. Victory over Athens brought responsibilities and challenges their legal system wasn't designed to handle. They suddenly found themselves ruling empires stretching across the Greek world, dealing with economic and political problems that couldn't be solved through military action. The Spartan legal system had no mechanisms for governing foreign populations, managing complex trade relationships, or adapting to empire cultural diversity. Within decades of their greatest victory, Sparta was already losing conquest control and facing new challenges from resurgent Athens and rising powers like Thebes and Macedon. In 371 BCE, at Lycurgus in central Greece, the impossible happened. A Spartan army, the same type that held Thermopylae Pass, conquered Athens, had been undefeated in major battles for over 2 centuries, was completely destroyed by Thebans. The defeat was so shocking many Greeks initially refused to believe the news. Sparta had seemed invincible so long their military supremacy had come to be seen as natural law, as permanent as mountains and seas. But Lycurgus proved even the most perfect military systems could be defeated when circumstances changed and systems failed to adapt. Theban general Epaminondas had studied Spartan tactics carefully, developing new strategies specifically designed to counter Spartan strengths, using innovative battle formations, superior numbers, and tactical flexibility. More importantly, he demonstrated Sparta's demographic decline had reached critical points. The Spartan army at Lycurgus contained only about 700 full citizens, barely more than twice Thermopylae numbers, but now trying to control empires instead of defending mountain passes. Lycurgus' defeat triggered consequence cascades, revealing how fragile the Spartan system had become. Within years, Messenia's helots had rebelled successfully, depriving Sparta of much agricultural foundation. Allied cities forced to submit to Spartan domination switched sides or declared independence. The Spartan Empire collapsed almost overnight. Yet even in defeat, the Spartan legal system continued functioning. Surviving citizens continued living according to Lycurgus laws, eating in Syssitia, training for militarily irrelevant service. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Spartan story. Their legal system was so deeply embedded in culture and perfectly designed for original purposes that it couldn't adapt even when adaptation became survival necessary. Spartans had created something unprecedented: total legal systems regulating every life aspect in service of single goals. For centuries, this gave them seemingly magical advantages to enemies. But when the world changed around them, their greatest strength became their greatest weakness. When Philip of Macedon received that single-word response, "What?" he understood something many previous conquerors had learned. Sparta's strength came not from walls, weapons, or individual soldiers, but from their laws. Legal systems creating history's most feared warriors were themselves unconquerable because they lived and shaped people's minds and hearts. The legacy of Spartan law extends far beyond ancient Greece. Military organizations throughout history have studied Spartan methods, trying to adapt techniques for modern use. The emphasis on rigorous training, unit cohesion, and absolute discipline became standard features of professional armies worldwide. The Prussian military system that dominated European warfare in the 18th and 19th centuries drew heavily on Spartan models. The officer training academies established by Frederick the Great included extensive study of Spartan methods, particularly their approaches to physical conditioning, psychological preparation, and the cultivation of military virtues. The British military reforms of the 19th century incorporated Spartan ideas about the relationship between character and military effectiveness. The public school system that produced British military officers was explicitly modeled on the agoge, with its emphasis on physical hardship, competitive athletics, and the subordination of individual comfort to collective goals. Even modern military special forces units show clear traces of Spartan influence. The selection and training processes used by groups like the Navy SEALs, the British SAS, or the Israeli Sayeret Matkal all emphasize the same basic principles that the Spartans pioneered: that exceptional military effectiveness requires not just physical conditioning and technical skills, but fundamental changes in psychology and character. But perhaps more importantly, the Spartan experiment demonstrates both the power and danger of using law to engineer society. Spartans proved it's possible to create legal systems so comprehensive and effective they can shape not just behavior but character itself. They achieved something most societies only dream of: perfect unity of purpose, absolute social discipline, and military supremacy lasting centuries. They created a society where every citizen was willing to die for common good, where individual interests never conflicted with collective needs, where social problems were solved through law rather than force. But they also demonstrated the terrible price of such perfection. In creating a perfect warrior society, they sacrificed almost everything else making life worth living: intellectual curiosity, artistic creativity, economic innovation, and personal freedom. The Spartans produced no great philosophers like Athens did with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They created no magnificent architecture like the Parthenon. They wrote no enduring literature, developed no scientific innovations, established no artistic schools that influenced later generations. Their single-minded focus on military excellence came at the cost of human flourishing in almost every other dimension. They created a society that was extraordinarily effective at one thing, but almost completely sterile in terms of cultural and intellectual achievement. This raises profound questions about the nature of human civilization and the trade-offs involved in social organization. Is it worth sacrificing everything else to achieve perfection in one area? Can a society that subordinates individual creativity and freedom to collective goals ever be truly great? The Spartan answer was clear. Yes, if the goal is important enough and the results are effective enough. For 8 centuries, they believed that military security was so crucial that it justified any sacrifice necessary to achieve it. and they were extraordinarily successful by their own standards. Sparta survived as an independent city-state for longer than most modern nations have existed. They maintained internal peace and stability, while most other Greek cities were torn apart by civil wars and political chaos. They created a sense of community and shared purpose that their citizens found deeply meaningful and fulfilling. But their success came at a price that most modern observers would find unacceptable. The Spartan system required the complete subordination of individual rights to collective needs. It demanded absolute conformity to social norms. It left no room for dissent, experimentation, or alternative ways of life. Most tragically of all, they created a system so perfect that it couldn't evolve. The very laws that made them great for 8 centuries ultimately made adapting to changing times impossible. They became victims of their own success, prisoners of achieved perfection. The secret law behind Sparta's fearsome reputation wasn't any single legal provision or military regulation. It was a recognition that law could be used as total social engineering tools, that every human life aspect could be regulated in service of single overriding goals. Spartans succeeded where countless other societies failed because they understood something fundamental about human nature. People will conform to almost any system of rules and expectations if that system is comprehensive enough, consistent enough, and compelling enough. They discovered that human behavior is remarkably plastic, that social institutions can shape not just what people do, but who they are at the most fundamental level. They proved that it's possible to create entire populations with shared values, attitudes, and capabilities that seem almost superhuman to outside observers. They created incentives so powerful that following law became not just socially necessary but psychologically inevitable. They made military service not just duty but the only path to meaning and respect. They turned self-sacrifice from ideals into practical necessities. For 8 centuries, this system worked flawlessly. Sparta produced the world's finest soldiers, maintained political stability other cities envied, and achieved social harmony seeming almost superhuman to outside observers. The system was so effective that it seemed to operate almost automatically. Citizens didn't have to be forced to follow the law, they wanted to follow it, because the law had shaped their desires and aspirations in ways that made compliance feel natural and necessary. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Spartan achievement. They created a legal system that transformed human nature itself. They didn't just regulate behavior, they engineered new forms of human character and motivation. But ultimately, their system's very perfection became its downfall. The world changed around them and they couldn't change with it. Their laws had made them too strong to be conquered but too rigid to survive. The story reaches its climax in those final decades when the contradictions built into the Spartan system finally became unsustainable. The demographic decline had become irreversible. The Helot system was consuming more military resources than it produced. The rigid social laws were preventing necessary adaptations to changing military and economic conditions. Yet even as their world crumbled around them, the Spartans continued to follow the laws of Lycurgus with religious devotion. They continued to eat in their syssitia, continued to train for military service that was no longer strategically relevant, continued to maintain social customs that no longer served any practical purpose. This might seem foolish or stubborn to modern observers, but it actually reveals something profound about the nature of law and social order. The Spartan legal system had become so deeply embedded in their culture and identity that abandoning it would have meant ceasing to be Spartan in any meaningful sense. They faced a terrible choice: adapt their laws and risk losing their identity, or maintain their identity and risk extinction. They chose identity over survival, and in doing so, They created one of history's most haunting examples of the power and the danger of perfect legal systems. When the final crisis came, when Sparta could no longer field effective armies or maintain control over their territory, they didn't abandon their laws or try to reinvent themselves. They simply continued being Spartans until there were too few of them left to matter. This is both the glory and the tragedy of the Spartan experiment. They created laws so powerful they could override the most basic human instincts, so comprehensive they could reshape fundamental human nature aspects, so effective they produced seemingly superhuman military capabilities. But they also created laws so rigid they couldn't bend without breaking, so perfect they couldn't improve, so successful they ultimately caused their own destruction. The 300 Spartans who stood at Thermopylae weren't making individual choices based on personal heroism. They were following legal and cultural systems, making that choice inevitable. Law had shaped them so completely they literally couldn't conceive of any other response. That is both magnificent and terrifying. It shows us what human beings can achieve when they commit themselves completely to shared purposes and common goals. But it also warns us about the dangers of creating systems so perfect that they eliminate the flexibility and adaptability necessary for long-term survival. As we reflect on this extraordinary chapter in human history, we might ask ourselves what lessons it holds for our own time. We live in an age when technology and social media allow for forms of coordination and control that would have impressed even the Spartans. We have the tools to create systems of incentives and monitoring that could shape human behavior on a scale that Lycurgus never imagined. The Spartan example suggests both the possibilities and the perils of such systems. It shows us that human beings can achieve remarkable things when they work together toward common goals. It demonstrates that law and social institutions can be powerful tools for solving collective problems and overcoming individual limitations. But it also warns us to be careful what we optimize for, because we might achieve it more completely than we anticipated. The Spartans wanted to create the perfect warrior society, and they succeeded, but they discovered that perfection in one dimension can create catastrophic failures in others. The secret law behind Sparta's fearsome reputation ultimately teaches us that there are no perfect solutions to the challenges of human organization. Every legal system, no matter how brilliantly designed, creates trade-offs and unintended consequences. The pursuit of any single goal, no matter how noble or necessary, comes at the cost of other valuable objectives. Perhaps most importantly, the Spartan example shows us that adaptability and resilience are more valuable than perfection. A legal system that can evolve and adjust to changing circumstances will ultimately prove more successful than one that achieves temporary perfection but cannot change. The Spartans gave us an unforgettable example of what human beings can achieve when they commit themselves completely to a common purpose. They showed us that ordinary people can be transformed into something extraordinary through the right combination of laws, institutions, and social pressures. They proved that discipline and sacrifice can overcome seemingly impossible odds. But they also gave us a warning about the dangers of perfection itself. Their fearsome reputation was built on laws that transformed ordinary human beings into something extraordinary. But in the end, those same laws prevented them from remaining human enough to survive in a changing world. When we think about Sparta today, we might focus on the dramatic moments, the 300 at Thermopylae, the laconic wit, the reputation for invincibility in battle. But the real story of Sparta is deeper and more complex than these heroic images suggest. It's the story of a society that dared to ask the ultimate question: what would happen if we designed every aspect of human life around a single, overriding purpose? And the answer they found changed not just their own civilization, but the entire course of human history. For 8 centuries, Sparta showed the world what was possible when human organization was pushed to its absolute limits. They created something unprecedented and unrepeatable, a society so perfectly designed for its purpose that it seemed to transcend the normal limitations of human nature. Their laws didn't just regulate behavior, they created new forms of human character. They didn't just organize society, they engineered new ways of being human. They didn't just solve the problem of military effectiveness, they redefined what it meant to be a warrior, a citizen, and a human being. And in the end, when their perfect system finally met challenges it couldn't overcome, they faced their fate with the same unwavering courage that had made them famous. They didn't compromise their principles or abandon their identity to survive. They remained Spartans to the end. This is perhaps the most Spartan thing of all, that when faced with the choice between adaptation and annihilation, they chose to be true to their laws rather than abandon the system that had made them who they were. The secret law behind Sparta's fearsome reputation was ultimately this: that law could be used not just to regulate behavior, but to recreate human nature itself. And in learning this secret, in pushing it to its ultimate conclusions, the Spartans both achieved immortal glory and ensured their own destruction. Their story reminds us that even the most perfect systems are still human creations, subject to human limitations and human flaws. But it also shows us the extraordinary heights that human beings can reach when they dare to dream of perfection, even if that perfection ultimately proves impossible to sustain. The messenger who carried that single word, "What?" back to Philip of Macedon was carrying more than just Spartan defiance. He was carrying the echo of 8 centuries of laws so powerful they had created a people who literally could not conceive of surrender, compromise, or defeat. And in that single word, we hear the voice of a civilization that chose perfection over survival, identity over adaptation, and honor over existence itself. That is the secret law behind Sparta's fearsome reputation, and it echoes still. If this journey through Spartan history has captivated you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to History Bedtime Stories for more fascinating tales from the ancient world. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest archaeological adventures and historical discoveries. In the comments below, let us know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is.